The air in the oncology ward tasted of antiseptic and cold metal. Dorothy sat in the hard plastic chair, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the book resting on her lap. She watched the clock on the wall. Every tick sounded like a hammer against the silence of the room. The door opened. The doctor stepped inside, his movements stiff and practiced. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the paper chart in his hands, scanning the lines as if searching for a different outcome. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and final in the small space. He laid the chart down and spoke. The words were precise, clinical, and absolute. Stage 4. Terminal. 3 months. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward. Dorothy turned her head toward the window. Outside, an oak tree swayed in the wind, its branches rhythmic and indifferent. She did not blink. She did not reach out. She simply let the weight of the sentence settle into the floorboards beneath her feet. When she finally looked back at him, her expression remained level. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement, and thanked him for the truth. The doctor lingered for a heartbeat, then turned and walked out. The front door clicked shut, sealing out the world. Inside, the living room was already heavy with the scent of tea and stale air. Her children were waiting. As she stepped into the light of the hallway, the dam broke. Their faces crumpled, eyes red and swollen, and the silence of the house was shattered by the sound of ragged, uneven breathing. They moved toward her in a blur of motion, hands reaching out to grip her arms, their shoulders shaking with the force of their weeping. Dorothy stood in the center of the room, anchored by their touch, yet she felt miles away. She watched the way their chests heaved, the way their fingers dug into her skin, and felt a strange, quiet stillness settling over her own heart. It was a cold, clear clarity that refused to be shaken by the storm of their sorrow. She reached out, patting their backs with a steady, rhythmic motion, but her mind was already drifting toward the quiet of the bedroom. The house vibrated with their mourning, a cacophony of loss that seemed to belong to another life entirely. She gently pulled her hands free from their grasp, stepped back, and asked them to leave the room. As the last of them exited, the house finally grew silent. The bedroom walls dissolved into a soft, velvet blackness. Dorothy let the weight of her body sink into the mattress until the floorboards and the ceiling ceased to exist. Then, the dark fractured. A light, sharper than any noon sun, poured into the space, yet it carried no heat that burned. It felt like the steady warmth of a hearth fire on a winter night. She opened her eyes to a horizon that stretched infinitely. She was standing in a field of wheat, the stalks tall, golden, and thick, swaying in a rhythm that defied the lack of wind. The air smelled of dry earth and sun-baked grain. She took a step, and the ground felt solid, real, and vibrant beneath her feet. Suddenly, the sound of the world fell away, replaced by a vibration that resonated deep within her chest. A voice, heavy and resonant like the tolling of a distant bronze bell, spoke her name. It did not travel through the air. It vibrated from the core of her own spirit. The voice said, "It is not your time." The light pulsed once, a gentle, golden wave that washed over her shoulders and pulled the tension from her limbs. She reached out to touch a stalk of wheat, but before her fingers could brush the grain, the field blurred. The morning light crept through the blinds, casting long, dusty beams across the quilt. Dorothy opened her eyes. The room was still, the air cool and motionless. She shifted her weight, expecting the familiar, sharp ache, but it did not come. She sat up, the movement fluid and effortless. She pressed her palms against the mattress, feeling the strength in her own wrists. She took a deep breath. Her chest felt light, as if a heavy stone had been lifted from her ribs. She stood, her feet meeting the floor. She walked to the window and pulled the blinds wide, watching the sun hit the garden. The world looked sharper, the colors more vivid. She turned and walked to the kitchen, the floorboards silent. She reached for the coffee pot, her hands steady as she measured the grounds. She poured the water, listening to the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the machine. She stood by the counter, watching the steam rise. There was no fear, no urgency, only a quiet, unshakable stillness. She poured a cup, held it in both hands, and felt the warmth. She was ready. The front door opened. The sound of heavy footsteps and the sharp click of metal cases hitting the floor broke the silence. The doctor entered, followed by a team of specialists. They moved with clinical precision, their faces set in professional, guarded lines. They did not speak. They set up the portable scanning equipment, the hum of the machines rising to a low, electric whine. Dorothy sat on the edge of the exam chair, her posture relaxed, watching them work. One specialist adjusted the sensor, his brow furrowing as he stared at the monitor. He tapped the screen, then leaned in closer, his eyes darting across the data. He looked at his colleague, who was already running a second scan. The room grew tight with a sudden sharp focus. They moved the sensors again, slower this time, their hands hovering over the controls. The monitor flickered, displaying a steady stream of data that seemed to defy their expectations. They checked the cables, recalibrated the sensors, and ran the test a third time. The specialists stopped moving. They looked at the screen, then at each other, their faces etched with a profound, mounting confusion. The lead oncologist stepped forward, pushing past the others to reach the monitor. His hands were shaking, the paper report rattling against the edge of the metal cart. He looked at the screen, then back at the report, then at the screen again. He blinked, as if trying to clear a blur from his vision, but the data remained unchanged. He turned to face Dorothy. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. The other specialists stood frozen, their breath held, eyes fixed on the man who had delivered the original diagnosis months ago. The head oncologist finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper, thin and fragile in the quiet room. "There is no trace," he said, his gaze shifting to the empty space where the shadows had once been. "The cancer is gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Nobody moved. The hum of the equipment seemed to drop away, leaving a vacuum of sound. The doctor looked at his own hands, then back at Dorothy, his eyes wide with a confusion that had shifted into something deeper, something like awe. The room was paralyzed by the weight of the truth. The silence in the room stretched, thick and unyielding. The specialists remained motionless, their eyes locked on the monitor as if the data might suddenly rewrite itself. Dorothy broke the spell. She shifted her weight, the chair creaking softly against the floor. She reached out, her fingers closing around the worn leather Bible resting on the side table. She stood up, her movements fluid and devoid of the hesitation. She looked at the head oncologist, a faint, calm smile touching her lips. He did not look back. He was still staring at the empty space. Dorothy turned away from the equipment and the frozen figures. She walked toward the door. Her steps were firm, each heel strike echoing. She pushed the heavy door open. The air on the other side was different. Sharp, cool, and filled with the scent of dew. She stepped out into the hallway, then toward the main entrance. The morning light poured through the glass panes, turning the dust motes into tiny, golden sparks. She did not look back at the room she had just left. She kept walking, her pace even and unhurried, moving directly into the brightness of the new day. The porch came into view, a wooden frame against the morning sky. Her family stood huddled near the railing, their shoulders hunched and faces drained of color. They had been waiting for hours, their eyes fixed on the path, braced for the worst. When they saw her, they did not move. They remained frozen, as if the sight of her walking, steady, rhythmic, and upright, defied the laws of the world they had inhabited since the diagnosis. Dorothy did not rush. She maintained her pace, the sound of her footsteps on the gravel path clear and deliberate. She reached the bottom step and stopped. The silence between them was heavy, not with the weight of impending loss, but with the shock of the impossible. She reached out, her hand steady and warm, and took their trembling fingers into her own. The contact broke the paralysis. Their grip tightened, knuckles whitening as they held on, searching her face for a sign of the truth. She squeezed back, a quiet pressure that anchored them to the present. The air around the porch felt different, stripped of the sharp edge of fear. She pulled them closer, and for the first time in months, the shaking stopped. A profound, unshakable grace settled over the space. They moved together to the wooden benches lining the porch. The frantic energy of the previous night had completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, resonant calm. Dorothy sat in the center, her hands resting comfortably on her lap, fingers interlaced. Her family sat close, their shoulders finally dropping away from their ears. They did not speak. There were no words that could bridge the gap between the terror they had felt and the reality they were now witnessing. Instead, they turned their gaze toward the horizon. The sky began to lighten, shifting from a deep, bruised indigo to a soft, bruised violet. Then, the first sliver of the sun broke over the edge of the world. It was a slow, deliberate ascent, casting long, golden fingers across the dew-covered grass. The light touched the trees, the porch railing, and finally, their faces. Dorothy watched the warmth bloom across the landscape, her breath steady and deep. She felt the presence of something vast and ancient, a force that moved through the morning air like a quiet, rhythmic pulse. Her family watched with her, their eyes reflecting the growing brilliance of the dawn. They were no longer anchored by the weight of the diagnosis, but by the simple, undeniable fact of the moment. The sun climbed higher, flooding the porch with a clear, unwavering light that seemed to wash away the last remnants of their fear. They sat in that stillness, side by side, acknowledging the grace that had intervened. The world was the same, yet entirely transformed, held in hands far greater than their own. They remained there as the day fully broke, content to simply exist in the quiet, golden aftermath of a life restored.